Imagine this, Cleopatra, the most powerful woman of her era, surrounded by gold, luxury, and loyal servants, yet utterly alone. Not in a dungeon, not chained, she was trapped in the quietest, deadliest prison imaginable, her own reality. Every letter she received, every visitor, every word spoken, controlled by a single man, Octavian. The man who didn't need armies to conquer her. He dismantled her world piece by piece, using something far more terrifying than violence, psychological isolation. She could see the palace, touch her treasures, hear familiar voices, but every ally, every source of information, every ounce of certainty was gone. The world outside existed, but only he decided what she could know. Every conversation she had with him felt voluntary, strategic, yet every move she made played into his plan. And then came her son, Caesarion, the one person who could save her legacy, or destroy it. Octavian made sure Cleopatra had no way to control the outcome. Every hope she held became a weapon against her. If you want to uncover how Octavian crushed a queen without lifting a sword, stay with us until the end. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Octavian didn't defeat Cleopatra by force. He dismantled her by removing everyone else. This wasn't a war of swords or siege engines. It was a war of silence. And the first move was simple and ruthless. Isolate the queen until the only voice left in her world was his. When Octavian entered Alexandria, he had legions at his disposal, but he barely used them. Violence would have been crude. Storming the mausoleum would have created a martyr. Killing Cleopatra outright would have ended the story too cleanly. Octavian wanted something far more useful than her death. He wanted her contained, mentally and emotionally, long before she was physically powerless. Cleopatra wasn't thrown into a dungeon. She wasn't chained or humiliated. She remained in the palace, surrounded by luxury, servants, familiar rooms, and royal comforts. From the outside, it didn't look like imprisonment at all, but that was the trick. Around her, an invisible wall was constructed. No visitors without permission, no messages in or out, no news of the city, no updates about Egypt, no information about her children unless Octavian allowed it. Every servant was searched, every object inspected, every word monitored. This wasn't confinement of the body. It was confinement of reality. Isolation works best when it feels gentle. Octavian understood that fear can harden resistance, but uncertainty dissolves it. Cleopatra had spent her entire life in constant motion, negotiations, alliances, rivalries, intelligence networks. Power, to her, meant information. Now, information was gone. The world beyond her chambers might as well not have existed. And into that vacuum stepped Octavian. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he didn't posture. He visited calmly, alone, sat across from her like an equal, and spoke in measured tones. He listened, he nodded. He asked questions. He offered nothing concrete, only possibilities, hints, maybes. Suggestions that cooperation could influence outcomes. Suggestions that her children's futures were not yet written. By cutting off every other voice, Octavian made himself the only source of meaning. When Cleopatra tried to understand what was happening beyond the palace walls, there was only one person who could tell her, and he controlled exactly how much truth she received. Isolation does something specific to the human mind. When there are no outside perspectives, doubt turns inward. Every decision becomes heavier, every word feels dangerous. Cleopatra began to calculate constantly. Speak too much, and she might reveal leverage. Speak too little, and she might appear uncooperative. Resist, and she risks retaliation. Comply, and she risks erasing herself. And there was no one to reality check those fears. Octavian ensured she never saw allies, because allies restore strength. He ensured she never saw crowds, because crowds remind rulers of their power. He ensured she never saw her children, because love hardens resolve. What he allowed instead was waiting, silence, time stretching without reference points. This wasn't accidental, this was engineered exhaustion. Even Cleopatra, fluent in politics, manipulation, and survival, could not escape the effect. Isolation doesn't need to break intelligence. It only needs to wear down certainty. Once certainty erodes, Even the sharpest mind begins negotiating against itself, and Octavian's demeanor made it worse. He wasn't cruel, he was polite, controlled, almost respectful. That softness was disarming. A visibly brutal enemy gives you something to fight. A calm enemy makes you lower your guard. Cleopatra was used to power. Struggles that were loud, theatrical, and openly dangerous. This one was quiet, administrative, and suffocating. By controlling information, Octavian also controlled time. Cleopatra didn't know how quickly events were moving. She didn't know who had already defected, who had been arrested, who had been executed. The outside world was changing by the hour, but for her, everything stood still. That mismatch creates panic without urgency, a psychological paralysis. Isolation also reframed choices. With no external input, every option looked worse than the last. There was no sense of momentum, no possibility of reversal, no indication that patience would help. The longer she waited, the more inevitable Octavian's victory felt. That feeling, inevitability, is what isolation is designed to produce. Octavian didn't imprison a queen. He removed her from the noise that made her powerful. He stripped away allies, information, reassurance, and resistance, one layer at a time, and once all that was gone, he didn't need threats. The situation itself became the threat. By the time Cleopatra realized what was happening, the damage was already done. Isolation had done its work. Not by breaking her spirit, but by narrowing her world until only one set of outcomes seemed possible. And that was the moment Octavian knew he was winning. Not because Cleopatra was weak, but because she was alone. Octavian never trapped Cleopatra with threats. He trapped her with possibility, with just enough hope to keep her talking, cooperating, and waiting. That was the brilliance of it. Fear makes people reckless. Hope makes them compliant. From the moment Cleopatra was taken back into the palace, Octavian made a deliberate choice. He would promise nothing clearly, and deny nothing directly. There were no written terms, no proclamations, no guarantees, only phrases that floated just short of commitment. Arrangements could be made, circumstances might be considered. The future of your children is not yet decided. Each sentence was open-ended, carefully unfinished, and that incompleteness was the weapon. Cleopatra had survived Rome by reading men. She knew how power spoke when it intended to crush you. Octavian didn't speak that way. He listened. He allowed her to speak about Egypt, about Caesar, about stability. He let her believe the conversation itself mattered. That belief kept her engaged. False hope works because it invites participation. Cleopatra wasn't forced to cooperate, she chose to. Every inventory she offered, every explanation of palace operations, every name she mentioned was given voluntarily, under the assumption that cooperation was building leverage. In her mind, she was still negotiating. In reality, she was surrendering information piece by piece. Octavian reinforced this illusion with timing. He didn't rush her. Visits were brief and spaced out. Days of silence followed polite conversations. That gap made Cleopatra replay every word, analyze tone, search for meaning. When people don't know where they stand, they fill the silence themselves. And they usually fill it with optimism, because optimism feels safer than despair. What made the strategy effective was that it wasn't obviously false. Octavian could spare her life. He could treat her children well. He could allow Egypt a softer transition. None of these things were lies. They were simply Neve. Promised. Hope doesn't require deception. It only requires ambiguity. Cleopatra responded the only way a rational ruler would. She tried to be useful. Useful prisoners live longer. Useful allies negotiate better terms. She positioned herself as a stabilizing force. Someone who could prevent rebellion. Someone who understood Egypt better than any Roman governor ever would. And for a while, that seemed to work. Octavian continued listening, continued asking questions, continued visiting, but the entire time he was extracting value while giving none. False hope also slowed resistance. As long as Cleopatra believed there was a path forward, she delayed drastic action. Suicide would have ended the game immediately, so would open defiance. Hope made her wait, and waiting was exactly what Octavian needed. Time allowed him to secure Alexandria, seize treasuries, neutralize loyalists, and eliminate threats without interference. The most dangerous thing about false hope is that it reframes surrender as strategy. Cleopatra didn't see herself as yielding, she saw herself as buying time. Every concession felt temporary, every cooperation felt reversible. That perception prevented her from recognizing when the point of no return had already passed. Octavian's restraint was intentional. If he had promised safety, Cleopatra would have demanded guarantees. If he had threatened her children outright, she might have acted immediately. Instead, he hovered in the middle, suggesting concern without commitment, power without aggression. That balance kept Cleopatra calculating instead of resisting. False hope also isolated her emotionally. Without allies to challenge her assumptions, she had no way to test whether Octavian's tone meant mercy or manipulation. There was no one to say, "This is a trap." Hope thrives in isolation because doubt has nowhere to land. Even when Cleopatra stopped eating, trying to reclaim control, Octavian didn't respond with force. He responded with clarification, a single reminder that her children's safety depended on her survival. Not a threat, just information, enough to restore hope that compliance still mattered, enough to keep her alive and cooperative. By the time Cleopatra realized that the negotiations were one-sided, the leverage she thought she was preserving was already gone. The treasury was seized, Egypt was pacified. Her options had narrowed to symbolism alone. False hope had done its job. It delayed resistance, encouraged disclosure, and transformed a defeated queen into an administrative resource. Octavian didn't need her trust. He only needed her belief that trust might still be useful. And when that belief finally collapsed, when Cleopatra understood that nothing she offered would change the outcome, the illusion vanished instantly. Hope didn't fade gradually. It snapped. And when it did, the game ended. Cleopatra's greatest asset was also her greatest vulnerability, her son, Caesarion. While her other children were young, malleable, and politically useful only within Egypt, Caesarion represented a threat that no one in Rome could tolerate. He was the biological son of Julius Caesar, the bloodline of the most powerful man in Rome, and a living reminder of an alternate claim to imperial legitimacy. Octavian understood this with chilling clarity. While he had inherited Caesar's name and political legitimacy, rough adoption biology required no recognition. Caesarion's existence alone challenged the foundation of Octavian's authority. From the moment Actium was lost, Cleopatra had been thinking ahead. She arranged for Caesarion to be sent east, far beyond Rome's immediate reach, with tutors and guards, ostensibly to India. The plan was simple: keep him alive, rich, and politically irrelevant. Cleopatra's every subsequent negotiation with Octavian was influenced by the knowledge that her son's safety determined her actions. Every inventory of treasure, every explanation of palace operations, every disclosure about loyalists, these were distractions, a way to keep Octavian occupied while her son moved farther from danger. Octavian, however, was not a man to leave loose ends. Caesarion represented a variable that could never be allowed to exist. Rome could manage conquered territories, assimilate children, and control wealth, but it could not tolerate a living direct descendant of Caesar who could, decades later, challenge the adopted heir. Octavian's consolidation of power was methodical, surgical, and patient. His ultimate goal was not simply to subjugate Cleopatra or absorb Egypt. It was to eradicate any rival claims to Caesar's legacy, and Caesarion was the last uncontainable factor. The trap was set far from Alexandria, in the journey of Caesarion himself. According to Plutarch, he had nearly escaped Octavian's reach, moving toward the Red Sea with the intention of leaving Egypt entirely. But even then, Octavian's influence had already extended into the smallest details. His agents, his messages, his manipulations reached Caesarion through intermediaries, advisors, and tutors. The young prince, guided by misinformation or subtle persuasion, returned to Alexandria under the belief that cooperation with Rome could secure his position. This was exactly what Octavian intended. He lured the last remaining threat back into the lion's den. Cleopatra's realization that her son had returned, unknowingly walking toward his own death, marked a pivotal moment. No further negotiation mattered. Every strategy, every display of cooperation, every attempt to preserve Egypt's wealth or her personal authority became meaningless in the face of the irreplaceable loss of Caesarion. It was the psychological culmination of Octavian's campaign. He had dismantled her alliances, her army, her information networks, and now her final, irreplaceable leverage, the life of her son, was gone. The calculated removal of Caesarion was not merely a political act. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. Octavian had engineered a scenario in which Cleopatra's decisions were guided by what she believed was possible, but every path had already been anticipated and neutralized. Her son's life, the one variable she could have protected above all else, had been manipulated by Octavian's precision. Cleopatra had always understood that her own survival was tied to her children's, but Octavian controlled the ultimate narrative. The boy's return sealed her fate. Caesarion's death, carried out quietly and efficiently, removed the last thread of potential rebellion. Unlike Antony, whose death was dramatic and public, Caesarion's removal was administrative, clinical, and invisible, an execution without spectacle. This left Cleopatra without hope of negotiation or resistance. She could no longer leverage the presence of a direct heir of Caesar. She was forced into the only option remaining, her own final act, a choice between submission to Octavian's triumph or a death of her own design. By the time Cleopatra understood the full extent of Caesarion's fate, the strategy had come full circle. Octavian had controlled her access to information, her environment, her children, and even her perception of what was possible. Caesarion was the instrument through which Octavian ensured that her autonomy, in its most meaningful form, was stripped away. The boy's existence had been her greatest hope and, simultaneously, her undoing. This episode demonstrates the precision with which Octavian approached power. He didn't need to kill Cleopatra outright. He didn't need to storm the palace with armies. He methodically removed every source of leverage, until the queen herself had no remaining choice. The psychological weight of losing her son, the only claim to Caesar's legacy in her hands, left her in a state of enforced compliance. Caesarion's life and death illustrated the most disturbing aspect of Octavian's strategy. He understood that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not the sword, but the calculated removal of what a person values most. Cleopatra's final decisions, including her choice to end her life on her own terms, were shaped entirely by this loss. Caesarion's removal made all else irrelevant. Octavian had conquered not just Egypt, not just a queen, but the very possibility of alternative power. He had turned what was once Cleopatra's greatest asset into the final instrument of her submission, leaving her with only one remaining form of agency: the manner in which she chose to die. In the end, Caesarion's fate was not just a political necessity for Octavian. It was a meticulously orchestrated psychological weapon. Through the calculated elimination of Cleopatra's last leverage, Octavian ensured that the queen would act within the confines of the narrative he had constructed. Her power, her ingenuity, and even her will were reduced to a single unavoidable reality. With Caesarion gone, the game was over. The young prince's existence and death encapsulate the most ruthless aspect of Octavian's genius, showing how the threat of what matters most can be more controlling than any army, any blade, or any public humiliation. When Cleopatra finally faced the reality of her situation, every option she had once relied on had been systematically stripped away. Her allies were gone, her army dissolved, her wealth seized, her information networks dismantled, and her son, the last remaining leverage against Octavian, was gone. Every path that might have allowed her to negotiate, escape, or influence the future was closed, and yet, in that absolute vacuum of power, there remained one arena where she could still exert control, the final act of her life. What she chose in those moments was not romantic or impulsive. It was deliberate, strategic, and profoundly meaningful. Cleopatra had spent her life navigating impossible circumstances. She survived political assassinations, civil wars, betrayals, and the manipulations of the most powerful men in Rome. Every decision had been a calculated risk, a negotiation between survival and authority, and now, in the face of Octavian's conquest, she applied the same principles to the choice left to her. Death, when carefully controlled, was no longer a surrender. It became an instrument of agency. By choosing the timing, manner, and context of her passing, she reclaimed a fragment of power that had been stripped from her in every other sphere. She prepared meticulously. On the morning of her final act, Cleopatra bathed, adorned herself in full regalia, and chose gold and purple, the colors of her dynasty, the symbols of Egyptian sovereignty and divine authority. She requested a visit to Antony's tomb, a ritual of mourning and respect that allowed her to frame her departure with dignity and precision. She was alone, except for her two most trusted attendants, women who had served her faithfully for decades. Even in this intimate setting, she maintained ritual, procedure, and symbolism. Every detail was deliberate. Every gesture, every item, every word was chosen to reflect her autonomy, her heritage, and her final statement to the world. Octavian's triumph depended on presenting Cleopatra as a living symbol of submission, a queen paraded in chains, a conquered foreigner displayed before Rome to validate his victory. That was the spectacle he sought, the narrative he had meticulously constructed over 10 days of psychological maneuvering. And yet, Cleopatra denied him that narrative. She refused to exist as a tool in his story. By choosing death, she circumvented the triumph he had so carefully orchestrated. She transformed what he intended to be a public demonstration of his power into a private, irrevocable assertion of her own will. The act itself, though shrouded in mystery, carried immense significance. Whether through poison, a hidden asp, or another method lost to history, Cleopatra ensured that her death mirrored her life, controlled, composed, and symbolic. Her attendants, Iris and Charmian, died alongside her, not as passive witnesses but as participants in her final act of agency. The queen's body was arranged, her crown adjusted, and her death became a carefully composed statement, a final tableau of royal authority that no Roman victory parade could diminish. Cleopatra's decision was also profoundly strategic. In her death, she retained the one form of leverage Octavian could not seize: her dignity, her story, and the moral authority of choice. He had stripped away her armies, her allies, her children's safety, her wealth, her mobility, and her access to information. He had anticipated every conventional strategy of resistance or compliance. Yet there remained one variable he could not control: Cleopatra's own decision regarding her life. In that sense, her death was a final victory, the only one left, executed with the same deliberate calculation she had used throughout her reign. The optics of her passing were equally significant. Octavian could claim Egypt, seize the treasure, and consolidate power. He could absorb the territory into Rome and display the surviving children as symbols of his clemency. Yet Cleopatra's death ensured that he could not completely frame the narrative of domination. She did not die humiliated or publicly tortured. She died sovereign in her own palace, in her own regalia, surrounded by attendants who honored her choices. By doing so, she denied Octavian the absolute triumph he had envisioned. This final act also illustrates the profound interplay between power and agency. Cleopatra had lost everything external: control over territory, influence over others, access to information, and the lives of those she loved most. What remained was her internal authority, the capacity to make a decision independent of Octavian's design. In choosing her death, she exercised the ultimate form of self-determination. It was a reminder that power is not always measured by armies, titles, or material wealth. It can also reside in the ability to determine the terms of one's own existence. Octavian's genius had been methodical, precise, and ruthless. He understood that breaking a queen's will was more valuable than killing her outright. Yet Cleopatra's final act transcended the mechanisms he had set in motion. He had stripped her of allies, territory, and leverage, and manipulated her hopes, her children, and her environment. But he could not strip her of choice. And in that act of choice, Cleopatra reclaimed control that no Roman legion or political maneuver could ever fully erase. In the end, her death was both an ending and a statement, It marked the conclusion of her reign, the fall of Egypt as an independent power, and the consolidation of Octavian's empire. But it was also a declaration of agency, defiance, and strategic mastery. By orchestrating her own death, Cleopatra demonstrated that even in the face of total domination, a ruler could maintain sovereignty over the most personal and consequential domain, her own life. Her final act reminds us that in situations where all conventional power is stripped away, agency persists in subtle but decisive ways. Cleopatra's choice was the only move Octavian could not anticipate or control. She had been defeated in every measurable sense, yet she remained undefeated in the realm that mattered most: the assertion of her own will, the crafting of her own narrative, and the control over the manner in which history would remember her. In that act, she transcended conquest and became, in her death, the ultimate symbol of autonomy and calculated resistance. Cleopatra's story is not a tale of simple defeat. It is a masterclass in psychological warfare, a demonstration of power beyond armies, swords, or gold. Octavian did not need to strike her down. He dismantled her world piece by piece, using isolation, false hope, and calculated manipulation of what she valued most. He removed allies, erased information, and controlled her perception of reality, leaving her trapped in a web she could barely see. False hope kept her engaged, making every cooperation seem strategic, every concession voluntary, while Octavian silently catalogued and neutralized her remaining leverage. And yet, the greatest weapon he used against her, the threat she could not fully see, was her own son, Caesarion. With his death, her last political and emotional advantage was gone. Every move she made, every negotiation, and every display of authority had been anticipated and neutralized, until there was nothing left to play but a single final decision. In that moment, Cleopatra reclaimed what Octavian could never take: her autonomy. She chose the manner, the timing, and the symbolism of her death, turning it into a statement of power, dignity, and defiance. Her life, her reign, and even her passing became a calculated assertion that, no matter how complete the conquest, the human spirit can resist control in ways no army can enforce. Octavian won Egypt, the treasure, and the narrative of empire, but Cleopatra preserved the one thing he could not: the power to end her story on her own terms. Her final 10 days show that true mastery is not always measured by what you conquer, but by the ability to choose your surrender, and in that choice, to remain unbroken.